You'll always be the failure in this family.
Then explain why my money paid for everything, and why this forensic report says you stole millions from me.
My family called me a failure for 8 years. They said it at birthdays, weddings, and every Sunday dinner. What they never said was that the failure had been quietly paying their mortgage, saving their businesses, and financing the life they used to humiliate her. Then a forensic accountant placed one report in front of me, and I discovered that my generosity had not simply been taken for granted. It had been turned into a weapon against me. Hello, my name is Claire Bennett, and this is the story of how I stopped begging my family to love me and made them answer for every dollar, every lie, and every signature they stole. I grew up in a comfortable suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. From the street, the Bennett family looked perfect. My father, Richard, owned a small commercial construction company. My mother, Diane, organized charity events and treated appearances like a full-time profession. My younger brother, Ethan, was the charming one. My younger sister, Melissa, was the beautiful one, and I was the dependable one. That sounds like a compliment, but in my family it meant something different. It meant I was the person they called when a tire blew out, a bill was overdue, or a business deal went wrong. I was useful in private and embarrassing in public. At 24, I left a safe accounting job and started a software company with my college friend, Marcus. We built a boring but valuable system that helped regional hospitals track equipment purchases. For 3 years, we worked from a tiny office above a laundromat. I wore discount clothes, drove an old Honda, and rarely talked about money. My family saw the old car and assumed the company was failing. I let them. Then a national healthcare company licensed our software. 2 years later, it bought most of our company. After taxes, my share was worth more than $12 million. I kept a minority interest and became a consultant, but I never announced the sale. I knew what sudden money did to people. I wanted time to understand my new life before anyone else tried to control it. That decision became my first protection and my first mistake. 3 months after the sale, my mother called me crying. My father's company had lost 2 contracts, and their mortgage was 6 months behind. They were days away from foreclosure. "Please don't tell Ethan or Melissa," she whispered. Your father would be humiliated." I paid the overdue balance and arranged automatic monthly payments through an LLC called Hawthorne Family Holdings. My parents were told that a private family trust had approved temporary assistance. Only my mother knew I was behind it. Temporary became 8 years. During those years, I paid $3,080.60 every month toward their mortgage. When my father's company needed $180,000 to finish a warehouse project, I provided it through a secured business loan. When Melissa's boutique collapsed after 11 months, I covered $92,000 in vendor debt so she would not be sued. When Ethan's restaurant failed a health inspection and lost its credit line, I invested $240,000 through another company and kept 23 employees working. I did not want praise. I wanted my family safe, but safety was never enough for them. At my grandmother's 70th birthday, Melissa arrived in a white Mercedes I had helped refinance. She looked at my old Honda and laughed. "Claire, when are you going to admit the little computer experiment didn't work?" Everyone laughed, including my father. My mother knew I had paid for half of Melissa's life. She lowered her eyes and said nothing. At Thanksgiving, Ethan raised a glass and gave a speech about taking risks. Then he looked at me and said, "Some people build a life. Other people hide behind spreadsheets." My father smiled. Claire was always afraid of the real world. I remember gripping my fork so tightly that my fingers hurt. I looked at my mother, waiting for one word. She only asked if anyone wanted more potatoes. Every humiliation followed the same pattern. In public, I was the unsuccessful older daughter. In private, my phone rang whenever money was needed. I kept helping because I believed love could be earned through patience. If I saved them one more time, perhaps they would finally see me. That is the dangerous thing about being the responsible child. You begin to confuse being needed with being loved. The first crack appeared in March, during a meeting with my attorney, Natalie Cruz. We were preparing to sell my remaining company shares and update my estate plan. Natalie reviewed a credit report and stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Claire, do you own property in Naples, Florida?" "No." "Have you guaranteed a $1.4 million loan for Bennett Lifestyle Group?" I laughed because the question sounded absurd. Then I saw her face. The guarantee contained my full legal name, social security number, and a signature that looked almost exactly like mine. Almost. The loan was current, but that did not comfort me. Someone had used my identity to secure it. Worse, Bennett Lifestyle Group was owned by Ethan and Melissa. Natalie told me not to call anyone. She contacted a forensic accounting firm in Cincinnati and brought in a retired federal fraud investigator named Samuel Price. Samuel was calm, gray-haired, and impossible to charm. He asked for 8-year bank records, tax returns, company documents, emails, and every financial agreement involving my family. What do you think happened? I asked. He closed his notebook. I don't guess before the records speak. For 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives. I attended family dinners and listened to Ethan boast about a property project in Florida. I smiled while Melissa described the vacation home she claimed an investor had provided. I watched my parents pretend they knew nothing. Meanwhile, Samuel followed the money. The second crack came from my father's construction loan. The $180,000 I had provided was secured by equipment and repaid monthly, or so I believed. The statements sent to me were false. The real payments had stopped after 4 months. Instead, my father's company had created invoices for work that never happened. Those invoices were submitted to Hawthorne Family Holdings, where someone had changed the payment instructions. Over 3 years, another $76,000 had been pulled from my accounts. The person authorizing the transfers used my mother's email address. When Samuel showed me, I defended her automatically. She barely knows how to attach a photograph. Then somebody wanted the trail to end with her, he replied. That sentence kept me awake all night. The next Sunday, I went to my parents' house. My father carved roast beef. Ethan discussed expanding his restaurant brand. Melissa complained that people without ambition were jealous of successful families. Then my mother placed an envelope beside my plate. The property tax increased, she said softly. We need another $12,000 by Friday. My father did not even look at me. If that little consulting work of yours can handle it. I stared around the table. They still believed I knew nothing. I'll see what I can do, I said. Melissa smirked. That is Claire's answer to everything. She will see what she can do. They laughed again. This time, I laughed again. 2 days later, Samuel found the center of the scheme. 8 years earlier, after I first helped with the mortgage, my mother had photographed a folder in my home office while feeding my cat during a business trip. The folder contained a copy of my passport, tax identification documents, and the signature page from my first company agreement. Those images were later sent to Ethan. Ethan created a private email address using my name. Melissa helped him answer identity verification questions because she knew my childhood addresses and the name of my first pet. My father introduced them to a loan broker who was willing to accept digitally signed documents without meeting me in person. At first, they used my information to obtain small credit lines. Then they became bolder. They created Bennett Lifestyle Group and presented me as its silent majority investor. They forged board resolutions. They used my net worth to secure the Florida property. They diverted money from the loans I had genuinely provided. They even purchased a $2 million life insurance policy on me, owned by their company, with Ethan and Melissa as indirect beneficiaries. I felt cold when I read that page. Are you saying they would profit if I died? Samuel did not dramatize his answer. Yes. There was no evidence they planned to hurt me, but they had built a financial future in which my death was valuable to them. That truth was worse than every insult. I went into the restroom and became sick. Then I sat on the floor and cried for the version of my family I had invented. I had believed they were careless, proud, and ungrateful. The report showed something darker. They had studied my loyalty, measured my silence, and used both as business assets. When I returned, Samuel had placed a thick binder on the table. The cover read Faran Assisi and Alasai Spinani Famel Transastians. The documented loss was 2,731,408. Natalie asked what I wanted to do. Part of me wanted to drive to my parents' house, throw the binder onto the table, and demand an explanation. But another part of me, the quiet part they had mistaken for weakness, finally took control. I want everything legal, documented, and impossible to undo, I said. For the next 10 days, we prepared. First, I froze every account connected to the forged guarantees and notified the banks through counsel. Second, I revoked access to Hawthorne Family Holdings and stopped the mortgage payments. Third, I called the insurer and disputed the life insurance policy. Fourth, I filed an identity theft report and provided evidence to the Ohio Department of Commerce and federal investigators. Then Natalie scheduled a family meeting. We told them I was considering a new family investment fund. Everyone arrived early. My parents' dining room had always been their stage. That evening, I made it mine. My father sat at the head of the table. Ethan wore an expensive navy suit. Melissa placed her car keys where everyone could see the Mercedes emblem. My mother kept twisting her wedding ring. Natalie sat beside me. Samuel placed 4 copies of the forensic report on the polished wood. Ethan's smile disappeared first. What is this? My father demanded. 8 years of our family history? I said. The honest version. Nobody opened the report, so I opened mine. I began with the mortgage payments $370,560. Then the legitimate business rescues $512,000. Then the forged invoices, diverted transfers, fraudulent credit lines, Florida guarantee, and life insurance policy. For every number, Samuel named the source document. For every denial, Natalie displayed an email, signature comparison, IP address, or bank record. My father tried anger first. You hired strangers to investigate your own family. No, I said. I hired professionals to investigate financial crimes. The criminals happened to be my family. Melissa began crying. She said Ethan had handled the paperwork. Ethan said my father had approved everything. My father said he had only been protecting the businesses. Then all three looked at my mother. She finally broke. We were going to pay it back, she whispered. I asked the only question that mattered. Why did you let them call me a failure? The room went silent. She could have apologized. She could have said she was afraid. Instead, she gave me the truth. Because if they knew how successful you were, they would have asked questions. Keeping you small kept everything simple. That sentence ended our family long before any court did. Ethan pushed back his chair. This is ridiculous. You gave us money. You cannot suddenly pretend it was stolen because your feelings got hurt. Samuel slid a signature analysis across the table. Voluntary gifts do not require forged signatures. Melissa looked at Natalie. What does Claire want? I closed the binder. I wanted a family. Now I want accountability. Then their phones began ringing. The Florida lender had frozen Bennett Lifestyle Group's accounts. Ethan's restaurant bank had suspended its credit line, pending a fraud review. Melissa's Mercedes was subject to repossession, because the financing application relied on false income records. My parents' mortgage payment had been canceled. My father's face turned red. You are throwing your own parents into the street. No, I said. I paid for this house for 8 years. You used the time I bought you to steal from me. What happens next is the result of your choices. He stood and pointed toward the door. Get out of my house. For the first time in my life, those words did not hurt. I gathered my report. The bank may soon have the same request for you. The investigation lasted 9 months. The evidence was too organized for them to dismiss as a family disagreement. Ethan accepted a plea agreement involving bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. He served 14 months in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution. Melissa avoided prison by cooperating, but received 5 years of probation, community service, and a restitution judgment that followed her after bankruptcy. My father pleaded guilty to falsifying business records and conspiracy. He lost his contractor's license and sold most of his equipment. My mother was not charged with the largest fraud counts, but she admitted providing my documents and helping conceal transfers. She received probation and was required to testify. The Florida property was sold, the Mercedes disappeared, Ethan's restaurant closed, though the employees received severance because I funded a separate relief account through an independent administrator. They had not participated in his crimes, and I refused to punish innocent people for my brother's choices. My parents also sold the house. I could have forced a rapid foreclosure. Instead, through Natalie, I offered one final arrangement. If they signed a complete admission, surrendered any claim against my companies, and cooperated with restitution, I would allow a 90-day private sale. They accepted. Some relatives called me cruel. They said family problems should remain private. I asked each one the same question. Would you call it private if a stranger forged your name for $1.4 million? None of them answered. A year after the meeting, my mother sent me a letter. It was 12 pages long. The first 6 explained our fear. The next 4 blamed my father. Only the last 2 contained an apology. I read it once and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, I learned, is not the same as restoration. I could release the anger without returning the keys to people who had robbed me. I used part of the recovered money to create a small foundation that helps victims of family identity theft obtain legal and forensic accounting support. The first recipient was a retired teacher whose nephew had opened credit cards in her name. When she hugged me after her case was resolved, I understood that justice could build something instead of merely destroying what was false. I also bought a house, not a mansion, just a warm place with tall windows and a garden. On my first Thanksgiving there, Marcus, Natalie, Samuel, and several friends filled the table. Nobody asked what I could pay for. Nobody laughed at my clothes or measured my value by my usefulness. Before dinner, Marcus raised his glass. To Claire, he said, who was never the failure in that family. For years, I had imagined how satisfying those words would feel. But when they finally came, I realized I no longer needed them. My family had spent 8 years calling me small because my silence made their lies look large. The forensic report did more than expose stolen money. It showed me the price of staying where love existed only when I was useful. They thought my generosity made me weak. They thought my privacy meant I had no power. They thought I would protect the family name, even while they erased mine. They were wrong. I did not destroy my family when I placed that report on the table. I simply stopped paying to maintain the illusion, and once the truth received the bill, none of them could afford the lie.